Well, hello and welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi. I'm exposing you to the intellectual side of Christian belief. That's what I do on my channel. And today I have two scholars, two of the top two historical scholars in the world on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And I have them on my channel today to share with you guys their testimonies, their stories, because both of these guys have really interesting stories, their interactions with the evidence. Gary was an agnostic, I believe, for a period as well. And I don't know if, Mike, you would qualify yourself as an agnostic, but both of you guys went through a period of doubt, and you came on the other side of it after you went and looked into the evidence as deeply as you have, and we're going to discuss that evidence that you guys found. And, yeah, let's get into it. So why don't we take about 60 seconds. Gary, tell everyone who you are if they don't know who you are, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, I'm Gary Habermas, Liberty University. I've been here for 39 years, believe it or not. And I'm chair of the philosophy department, and my full-time teaching position is in the PhD program. So I love it because our students are very advanced, and I just love, if you're gonna have good information, you want to go to good people who can use it in ministry, and that's what I'm excited about. And then I'm involved in this for 6 years now, just past the 6-year mark on this huge resurrection project at just a little under 5,000 pages right now. So that's my life.
Awesome.
Oh, and I'm quarantined.
Yeah, right now, if you're watching this in the future, however long in the future, we don't know how long this thing is going to last, but we're all under quarantine right now, so to speak. Maybe when you're saying quarantine, you're saying like it's a legitimate stay in place, can't get out of your house. We're dealing with the coronavirus right now, so we're all pretty much just stuck in our houses, all going crazy. Well, anyways, let's. So, Mike, tell everyone a little bit about your story, or who you are.
Yeah, I'm a former student of Gary Habermas, and if it not been for him, I'm almost certain I wouldn't be a Christian today. So I just owe him everything. He's just amazing. And very much looking forward to his magnum opus on the resurrection. I know he likes my book right now, but boy, when his comes out, it's going to make my book look like the Reader's Digest version. I teach at Houston Baptist University and teach New Testament and apologetics there, and love it at HBU. So yeah, I'm 58 years old. And so Gary and I co-authored a book years ago on the resurrection. And then I have a large book on it that is a slightly revised version of my doctoral dissertation. And then shortly after I got my PhD, which was about, 11 years ago, I began more studies in the Gospels, and since then have been working on gospel differences and gospel reliability. Those matters.
Well, I really appreciate you guys coming onto the channel. Gary, we had our in-person interview a couple years ago, and it was amazing. We posted it up, and right now it's just over 200,000 views. If you guys are interested in an in-person interview that I did with Dr. Habermas, check the link in the description. Mike has also been on the channel at least once, and we hope to have him more on in the future. But we did a discussion on Rhett and Link, their recent videos they put out on their deconversion or their falling away from the faith. So we had a really excellent discussion with Dr. Braxton Hunter, Dr. Mike Licona, and myself on some of the things that they said. So if you're interested in that, check the archive, the description of the video as well for links to that. All right, let's start with you, Gary. I want to get more into your background. Actually, before we do that, do you guys have books that you've written on the resurrection that we can just like show people in case they want to know more and dig into this further? Do you have them like ready, available? You can just like put them up to the screen.
Oh, you seriously?
I'm serious.
Take me 10 seconds to get it, I suppose.
Let's do it.
Well, Cameron, I'll tell you the short story. I've written 40-something books, but exactly half of them are on the resurrection. So I have 20-something resurrection books.
Oh my goodness. What's like the number?
Go ahead.
I'm starting to question whether or not this was a good idea.
This is the one with Mike and me. Mike can show you the big one that he's got with InterVarsity, the one that's longer than Tom Wright's book. This is our one that we did together.
The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus.
I just happen to have a few of them right here because I'm doing research This is a little one on the resurrection as a center of theology. This is 100 pages of PhD notes on the resurrection that just gives the whole case in a really small little book. That's just a few of them I have right here without running around the room. Oh, I forgot. I got one other one that's close to me. So out of 23, you just saw 4 of them. The Risen Jesus and Future Hope, which is probably my favorite, unless I count the one that Mike and I wrote together, which I just love as well.
Well, and also what you're doing is you're working on, Mike already mentioned this, you're working on a 5,000-page magnum opus right now on the evidence for resurrection.
Might even be longer because we're actually formatting one of the volumes right now, and it's way longer than we thought it was going to be.
Where are you at right now with that project?
With the little formatting, changing the pages, I'm probably give or take right about exactly 5,000 pages.
Wow. That's amazing. Well, yeah, so I've listened to your testimony before, and I just found it really interesting how you went through this period of doubt and then the evidence kind of brought you back. So take about 5-10 minutes or however long you'd like to spend just telling your story, where you went and why you were experiencing doubt, and then sort of what brought you back.
Well, I was raised in a German Baptist home, went to a German Baptist church. I don't know if this had a lot to do with it, but some experts say that when somebody dies in your life between the ages of 8 and 11, that's the worst time to have somebody die, because that's the time when most people solidify their views of an afterlife and meaning in life and so on. And the person who was the closest individual to me in my life, closer than my parents at the time, was my great-grandmother, and she died when I was 8 years old. And I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but a little while after that, I started thinking, what if I got sick and what if I died? And then in my early teen years, I started having questions about Christianity and wondered if it were true. And my friends would start saying, well, hey, haven't you ever heard of the reliability of the New Testament? You know, they found Noah's Ark. Yeah, what about creation? Good evidence for creation. We know that, we have human and dinosaur tracks together. Of course, that's not said anymore. That's from the Paluxy riverbed down in your area there, Cameron. But, and I started checking all kinds of things out. And even at that young age, I just thought, some of these things like the reliability of the New Testament, limited stuff at that time, F.F. Bruce's book, New Testament Documents of the Reliable, but limited material. And I thought, interesting, pretty good. New Testament measures up better than all the other classical books, but I don't get the truth of Christianity out. I just get good copies, early copies. So I went on doubting, and one day in picking up a book, it occurred to me that if the resurrection of Jesus were true, and I had no idea about the evidence at that time, but I thought, well, just in principle, in outline, if the resurrection is true, it would not only be a step forward on all these other evidences, but I could see an argument from Jesus' teachings to eternal life, what I now call the yellow brick road. I can see a path that says, let's get on the yellow brick road, let's keep marching, ignore the big tin man and with the axe, and look out for the lion, and boy, these woods are dark, and here's all the poppies that put you to sleep, and whoops, across the field is the Emerald City, and you get on the path and you start going. And I like that idea, and I thought the resurrection could do it if it happened. And, personally, Cameron, that is what set me on the path. It was a lifetime path, and people ask me all the time when I do interviews on doubt, they'll say, well, did you do this to help everybody? And I said, I wished I could say that, but I did it to help me. I did it because I didn't know if there was, now later, I hope I'm helping people, and that's great, but that's not how it started. It was to find a path. Now, I actually got to two stages that were very rough for me. I was older by then. I'd already been doing it for 5 straight years. And I got to a stage where I thought, I give up. You cannot show the resurrection happened. You can believe it by faith, and even Bart Ehrman concedes that. You can know it by faith, but there's no way you can know the resurrection happened. That was really sad time for me. and launched me into another deeper area of doubt. Then there was one other time later. I'd actually already had my PhD, so I wasn't some kid here. You know, a lot of people go, yeah, well, I was an atheist when I was 13, but that's not what I'm talking about. I already had my PhD, and I went through a period where when my mother called me, I was living a long way away from home, and I was married. But she called me and asked me how I was doing with my doubt, and I told her that probably I was on a trajectory that in 2 or 3 months, I told her I would probably be a Buddhist. So those two stages, you can't.
You'd be a what?
A Buddhist.
Oh.
And I've told that story a lot, but I mean, it was serious. I've told a lot of people knew what I was going through. There were times when I thought I don't think it really happened, but there were times when I thought, you know, that particular night, I remember the night, I thought I may have walked away from Christianity that night. I mean, it was pretty serious when I think back about it. So anyway, those two stages, can't prove it, but you can believe it by faith. And later, the Buddhist stage. But I got through the major objection that said you couldn't prove it. And by the way, that was playing around with the hallucination theory. That was what did me in for a while. And the Lord brought me back and through it. And I don't say this triumphantly. I say it after 10 years straight and 10 more years of partial of doubt. I say, I don't think I've doubted, and I don't think I have doubts. I wouldn't be afraid to say so, but I don't think I've had doubts in 20 years.
Well, we're going to get into, we are going to talk about the evidence. I mean, that's the whole point. But it is interesting to hear where people go, because a lot of people assume that people aren't on this journey of truth seeking. But I think that, especially in both of your cases, you can't really say that. You went on this truth seeking journey, and it's important for people to understand that we're kind of all doing the same thing. We're doing the best that we can. I wanted to mention this, Gary, that you wrote the foreword for this book. I just interviewed him. I don't know if you can see this, by Joseph Bergeron.
Joe Bergeron. Yeah.
He corrected me as Bergeron.
We also did an article on hallucination for the Irish Theological Quarterly.
That's what we talked about. We had an excellent discussion.
One other thing I should tell you, Cameron, in retrospect, I just thought about it. When I started, I spent 5 semesters in a Christian school. Everything else was secular. I still remember debating Christians in the Christian school, college, telling them the Bible is not inspired and they couldn't know these things were true. And this is in inner city Detroit. And a guy walked up to me. He was big. He was like an offensive lineman. He walked up to me and he said, I didn't know his name. He said, I hear you don't think the Bible's inspired. And I said, you're right. And he towered over me and he looked down at me and I thought, what's he going to do? Hit me? I mean, he didn't look happy. And he said to me, man, this is a quote. He said, man, you've got 7 demons in you. And he turned around on his heel and walked the other way. And I thought, 7 demons, a brawl, 7 demons, a brawl. I guess I'll take the 7 demons. But that was one little episode during my doubts.
Oh, my goodness. Well, let's bring in Mike here and get his. Tell me your story. Refresh the audience on your story and your background as well. And same amount of time, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll get into the evidence for the resurrection. So stick around, guys. We are going to get into it. Also, wanted to mention that we're going to go for about a total of 2 hours today. So we've been going at this point for about 20 minutes. And what we're going to do is take Q&A as well at the end. Maybe we're going to try to reserve the last hour or so for Q&A. So if you're a skeptic, if you're doubting the resurrection, save your questions. Don't ask them in the live chat yet, but we are going to get to them. And I'm going to focus primarily on your skeptical questions. So if you have a question about the resurrection, you're skeptical, you don't know if it's true, then this is the live stream for you. And I want you to be able to ask your questions to these guys. So Mike, take it away.
Well, I became a Christian at the age of 10, and I didn't grow too much spiritually during my teen years. I was planning on becoming a professional jazz musician. I played saxophone, and I was looking at a university like Towson University. I lived in Towson, Maryland. They had a good jazz program. And my parents, they would watch the Old Time Gospel Hour with Jerry Falwell on Sunday evenings, and they found out about a college for the weekend, and they said, hey, would you like to go check it out? And I thought, well, I'll check it out. I'm going to Towson, but I'll check it out. And I went down there, and I'd gone to public schools all my life in Baltimore City and Baltimore County. But I went to Liberty, and in, I think it was April of 1979, went for a college of the weekend, and I just fell in love with the school. It's the Christian environment was just amazing. Now, I think there was only, maybe 1,200 students at that time or somewhere around there. There were maybe 2,000. I forgot around that time, and this was a little before Gary came, I believe, a year or two. Or what? Gary, what year did you come to Liberty?
81.
Okay, so 2 years before he came. And anyway, I just fell in love with the school, and I thought I've got to go there. So I went there. They didn't have a great music program. It was fine. I had a good mentor there who taught me, but it was classical music, and I was more interested in jazz. But I got used to it, and I'm glad it just worked out this way anyway, because as much as I loved playing jazz on the sax, it is nothing compared to what I'm doing today in terms of personal enjoyment for me. Anyway, so I'm growing spiritually a lot there during my undergrad years, and I found that by my senior year, I was reading scriptures about an hour a day. I was praying at least an hour a day, 1 to 2 hours a day. I was just really drawing close to the Lord. And so I decided I wanted to go to grad school, and I wanted to learn Greek, the original language of the New Testament. So I took 1 semester, my final semester in college. I took it as an elective. I got an A in it. I was pretty much an average student. I had a high C average. I think it was I graduated with a 2.8 something. So I wasn't all that great in my studies, but I just fell in love with Greek. And so I applied to grad school. They let me in on probation. They made me take a year's worth of Greek over the summer. I aced that. Aced all my Greek courses in grad school. I took the equivalent of 5 years of graduate level Greek. And I was just studying the New Testament in its original language. I took as many courses as I could with Dr. Ron Sauer, who now teaches at Moody. And he was F.F. Bruce's final doctoral student. And he was just amazing. I loved Dr. Sauer. And so anyway, my final semester, I remember I started to have some doubts about the Christian faith. And it wasn't anything that I had actually learned while at Liberty. It was just reflecting and thinking, the only thing I know about religion is what I've been brought up to believe and think since, a child. I know that a religion named Islam exists. I know they believe in Allah and there's Muhammad, but I really don't know what they believe. I knew about Buddhism and Hinduism, but I really didn't know what they believed. I didn't have my first conversation with an atheist, where I was sharing my faith until I was in college. But then after that, not too much. So anyway, I started to think, well, if I'd been born in Afghanistan, would I be a Muslim? If I'd been born in China, would I be an atheist? Have I deceived myself all these years? I believe I've had a close relationship with God. But maybe I've just deceived myself because Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and Muslims, that they all think the same thing. So my roommate, I had a roommate named Jeff, and he was in the apologetics master's program at the time. It was my final semester in the New Testament program at Liberty. And he was studying under Gary in the philosophy and apologetics. Up until that point, I had no use for apologetics. I wasn't interested in it at all. He'd come back and where we were rooming together, and he'd tell me how he's learning about how to answer David Hume, who lived in the 18th century. And I said, well, why? I mean, that was 200 years ago. Mm-hmm. Why are you just getting around to answering him now? And, I just wasn't interested in all this stuff until I needed it. And he said, maybe you should go talk to Gary. He's a good guy. So I went, knocked on his door. He invited me into his office. We had a discussion. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. He shared with me some of the evidence for the resurrection. I shared with him my doubts. He made me feel comfortable. It didn't make me feel bad at all about having doubts. He said a lot of people had doubts. So we talked. I got my answers and felt pretty good about my faith. And then I left grad school and started running into some folks and sharing my faith, atheists, and they'd share some things that I had no idea how to answer them. And so I ended up calling Gary. There was no email back then, so I called him, and I'd bug him, and so he'd refer me to books, and I'd buy books, and I'd read these books, and I'd ask him questions, and that's how I got involved in apologetics. And then just to wrap this up, later on, after Gary and I wrote our book, and we're finishing that, I think we were wrapping it up at the end of 2002. I said, all these different scholars that you're aware of, and they look at the same data and they arrive at different conclusions. Who are these scholars? And he said, well, most of them are New Testament scholars, few philosophers. I said, well, any historians? If this is a historical question, are any historians doing this? And he said, yeah, a few. He said maybe a handful of historians have tackled the question of Jesus' resurrection or written on it. And I think the most that professional or general historian had written on it was Paul Meyer in a very small book. And, I was looking for something that would, Paul Meyer's a great guy too. I love him. I was looking for something though that was, really exhaustive and, what were the tools that historians used? And nobody had done that up to that point. So I thought, well, I'll do it and I'll prove the resurrection from a different angle. But as I got into my research, I found that philosophers of history are unanimous in saying there's no such thing as an objective or completely open-minded or neutral historian. Everybody has their biases. And these biases and agendas jeopardize the integrity of the research. And I thought, well, that's me, I have my own biases here, my own agenda in proving the resurrection. So by nature, I found I'm a second guesser. I just second guess everything. And it's just the way I'm wired, not just my worldview, but whether I married the right girl, whether I bought the right watch, the right car, the right house. And I just second guess and triple guess. And if you're going to do it with small things like a watch, much more, your worldview, because eternity could hang into balance with it, depending on which religion is true. So I decided that I was going to look into this and do the best I personally could at managing my own bias and agenda. So I was studying the philosophy of history, historical method, and articulated 6 steps that I took to manage my bias while my investigation proceeded. And so whereas in grad school, writing a 20-page double-spaced paper with a few footnotes was a real chore for me and something I did not want to do, my doctoral dissertation ended up being more than 500 pages single-spaced and more than 2,000 footnotes. And I just became obsessed with it. So, but at the end of the day, I could say, hey, I did look at this with integrity. And of course, we can't prove Jesus' resurrection with 100% certainty, but I do think that we can have a great deal of confidence that it occurred, it's not only plausible, but it's very likely that it occurred. So you asked for books. The book, my slightly revised doctoral dissertation, Gary mentioned, it's like 700 and some pages. This is it, and that was translated into 2 different languages last year. The first one is Spanish. That came out. That big book was translated into Spanish.
Congratulations, that's awesome.
Well, thanks. And then a couple months later, they came out with it hardcover in Korean. And this Korean version is beautiful. I mean, it's hardcover, and you look at the pages, and they're just... the pages are such of a high quality. The Koreans really did a fantastic job on this book. So I'm pretty excited to see that. And Yeah.
I wanted to mention real quick that we titled this Proof of the Resurrection. And the reason why I use that kind of language is to kind of draw people in. We want people to watch this content and view the videos. But I think proof, the way that it's used, people use that term, they don't necessarily mean like mathematical proof. You're asking for evidence. Most people are, when they say, prove to me that this is true, they're not saying prove to me with 100% certainty. They're saying, give me a good reason, give me a good argument to think that that's true. And that's what we're doing here, is we're presenting evidence. So let's get into it. What is like, we're going to take as long as we need to for this. Gary, in our interview, you said that you could do it in less than 5 minutes. Give me a good argument, give a good case for the resurrection. Let's take a little longer than 5 minutes, but where would you like to start?
Well, before I do that, let me make a comment about the proof thing. Totally agree with Mike that we don't have proof, but lest the listener think, well, if they don't have proof for the resurrection and whatever comes after that, keep in mind that any inductive argument, which includes the sciences, any inductive argument, soft sciences, hard sciences, psychology, history, the soft ones, anthropology, the harder ones, physics, they're all probabilistic. It's all probabilistic. And one more thing, just to show you how probability theory works. If you have 3 arguments for something, now your mind can kind of wander, but if you have 3 arguments for God's existence, 3 arguments for the resurrection, 3 arguments for an afterlife, reliability of the New Testament, if you have 3 arguments, and here's the key, they're all independent. They don't rely on the other ones. One could be false and one could be true. If you have 3 arguments, say reliability of the New Testament, and they don't overlap, and each one, if you were to put it into probabilities, and historians aren't crazy about that, but more and more are doing it. And if you put that into a percentage, so you have 3 arguments, and here's the setup. If you have 3 arguments for something, and each one is at least 80% reliable, 3 arguments, independent, 80% reliable, the likelihood that one of them is true is about 99%. So I think that's kind of stunning. When we say probability and the listener goes, oh no, just probability? Understand that probability goes all the way up to 99.99999. In 380s, you could put any combination you want, 2 90s, 2 80s and a 70, where you'd put it there. Now, it's a little bit subjective for you to say what you think the percentage is, but you can get in the high 90s just by probability calculus. So just those points. Yeah, if I were to make a case for the resurrection, Cameron, I would take way less than 5 minutes. If somebody said, yeah, give me what you have. In 1 or 2 sentences, I would say, the argument I like to use, which I call the minimal facts argument. I can tell you sometime how I got doing that, but I started doing this when I went through my period of doubt. And the question I asked was, if critics are correct, and this thing in the Gospels didn't happen, and that thing in the Gospels didn't happen, I can't use that text, that one didn't happen, and this one, and I wrote a statement at that time. I was in college. I was later in college. And I wrote a personal statement saying the Bible wasn't inspired, my own statement. And so if I'm going to reject this, and this, here's my question. Is there enough to say the resurrection still occurred? And so then I made the next step. Okay, I'm going to use Rudolf Bultmann, who was the hot critic at that time. I put him easily to the left of Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman makes concessions that Rudolf Bultmann would never make. And I said, okay, can I use Rudolf Bultmann or David Strauss, if you want a 19th century guy who's just like Bultmann? If I use their data, can I get a resurrection? Their data. So in other words, would an unreliable New Testament stop me? And here's the argument. 1 sentence. I can use the facts that the most critical scholars, and that's the key, they've got to be a scholar with a terminal degree in a relevant field. If I can use the facts, which relevant scholars, critical scholars, I don't care if they're atheists, if I can use their facts and get to the resurrection, to me, that's the strongest possible argument for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, Mike and I, we're in different contexts. We use different numbers of facts. I don't know what number he is now. He did 3 in his dissertation. Then at the end of his dissertation, he brought some others in and said, I think these maybe should be admitted into the group 2. So we play around with how many other facts are there. But right now I'm using 6. And I could do them real quickly. And the percentage of scholars who are going to agree to this are in the 90-something percentile. And when you say, well, how do you know that? I say because I counted. I counted the guys. More about that later if you want to talk about it. But here's the 6. Jesus died by crucifixion. The disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Bart Ehrman says it's absolutely incontrovertible. He said it's proven by history. Okay, they had experiences that they believed of the risen Jesus. It was proclaimed very early. You know, when I first started doing this, Cameron, they put that date. Critics would put that date and say, maybe Paul got it in Jerusalem at +5 years after the cross. We are way back on that. Bart Ehrman says there are a bunch of New Testament texts from sermon summaries and early creeds that can be dated 1 to 2 years after the cross. Jimmy Dunn, as influential as any New Testament scholar, says the creed in 1 Corinthians 15:3 may have been dated by the end of the same year Jesus was crucified. That would give about 9 months for that thing to come about. So early. That's number 3. Number 4, they turned the world upside down. To what extent? Well, I don't argue that we have to prove the disciples died as martyrs, but I do think that some of the key ones did. We have good first century data, and all the ones we know about were willing to die. Now you can say, well, how do you know? You can't read minds. I'm not reading minds. I'm looking at actions. And if you continually go into the roughest places and you continually get beat up and you, like Paul, get stoned and your followers think you're dead and you keep going back to the same place, that means you're willing to die for that message. And if the message stays the same, which in the New Testament is always minimum, factual side, minimum, deity, death, resurrection of Jesus, then and you're turned on by that, that's cool. The last 2, 5 and 6, are the 2 skeptics. James is not established as well as Paul, but that James and Paul both have this characteristic. They both became Christians as far as Paul for sure and James probably became Christians because of what they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. So that's it. Crucifixion, real experiences, proclaimed very, very early, turned the world upside down, turned their lives upside down, James and Paul. I would use those facts, and let me just say, when I say 6 facts, I mean the data that confirm the facts. And when I say data that confirm the facts, I'm talking about data the critics allow. I'm going to use their methods. So I'm going to use arguments that for the most part, a Bart Ehrman will allow. For the most part, Rudolf Bultmann will allow them. And we can use that data. If you get a resurrection from that data, you're on the way in the right direction. So that's the argument in a nutshell, using the critics' facts to say you don't have a leg to stand on.
So let me give like a quick... Sorry, I was hearing a little echo there. Hopefully it's not going to be too much of a problem. So I was hearing 6 different facts that you gave. Is crucifixion appearances proclaimed early. They turned the world upside down. James became a Christian after he had an appearance, and same thing for Paul. And what you're doing is you're saying that there's these 6 facts that are best explained by the resurrection of Jesus being resurrected from the dead. So the overall strategy here, and Mike, you have a lot of great analogies that you use in your work when you're giving like the basic overall structure of how an abductive argument works. Maybe we should do that. What's like a good analogy? I mean, in the medical field, when doctors will look at symptoms from somebody and they'll say, well, look, you have a runny nose, you have a sore throat, you probably have X. You know, this is my diagnosis based on your symptoms. Is this? Go ahead and give it. I just want to give like an overview of the overall strategy, how an abductive argument works in the context of and this is what historians do too. We do this all throughout our lives as well. Like, anyways, Mike, yeah, what's a good analogy?
Well, the 2 that would come to my mind immediately would be physician that you mentioned, and then also detective. So, for example, a detective would come on a crime scene. Maybe there's someone laying on the floor dead, and there's an empty shell casing of a 9mm bullet, maybe a couple of empty shell casings. There's a gun on the floor. So you say, okay, the guy's dead, right? All right, I see the empty shell casings, 9mm. Okay, was this guy shot with a 9mm? You know, he's dead. There's a gun there, 9mm gun. Well, what if they look at the body and it's not a 9mm that killed the guy? It was a .40 caliber. Well, then what's the 9mm and why the shell casings there? So you form all these hypotheses of what's going on. Well, maybe this guy fired 2 shots and this was his 9 millimeter, but the guy that killed him had a 40 caliber, and he's no longer here, and he picked up the shell casings and left. So you look at the data. The data would be, you got the 9 millimeter empty shell casings, you've got the guy laying dead, you've got the bullets in him that are 9 millimeter, or that are 40 caliber. He's dead. That's all our data. And then you formulate hypotheses to figure out what's going on. Now, if he had 9 millimeter in him, and you got the 9 millimeter shell casings, well, then all of that becomes evidence, but of a different type. So that's one thing. A physician, we're looking at, here we are in April of 2020, and we're in the coronavirus pandemic. So, what are the symptoms? All right, well, you've got a fever, temperature, you got body aches, you have a cough. Well, is that because of that could be coronavirus. Trouble breathing, could be that. But it could also be due to allergies, because we're in the worst part of the allergy season, pollen season right now. Or maybe it's a different kind of flu. So you would look at different kind of symptoms. You'd look at all these kinds of things and put them together. You formulate hypotheses, and see which one best explains the facts. When it comes to historical method, my favorite philosopher of history is Behan McCullough, a historian, philosopher of history in Australia, retired a few years ago. And he actually has spelled out a specific criteria for assessing hypotheses. So one would be explanatory scope. You take all the data into consideration, and which hypothesis explains the maximum of all that data. The one that explains the most data is to be preferred over the one that can't explain some of the data. Explanatory power. Given the truth of the hypothesis, what kind of data do we expect? To the extent that we get that data, a hypothesis may be said to have explanatory power. So, and the one that it can account for the most in that sense, and almost like predicts it, what we have, that the one with the greatest explanatory power is to be preferred. A third criterion is less ad hoc. Now, ad hoc is Latin meaning for this. You hear about an ad hoc committee. An ad hoc committee is formed in order to address a specific issue. Otherwise, the committee wouldn't exist. We might think of it as improvisation. So in every hypothesis, there's going to be some degree of improvisation, a degree of non-evidenced assumptions. So the hypothesis that is least ad hoc is to be preferred. And then finally is plausibility. Plausibility is the degree to which a hypothesis is compatible with our background knowledge. So if the hypothesis is that a 2-year-old boy bench pressed 200 pounds, we'd say based on our background knowledge, that hypothesis is implausible. But if we add something in it, like a big muscle man, a bodybuilder, helped that 2-year-old bench press, well, then it becomes plausible. So the hypothesis that is most plausible is to be preferred. So these are the 4 most important criteria that we would look at. And you assess hypotheses by these criteria, and the one that best fulfills all the criteria is regarded as what probably occurred. And I'll just add one more thing here. When it comes to proof, I agree with everything Gary said about the proof thing. And it's true that we could say the resurrection is not proven if we're defining proof as 100%. But I'd also be very quick to add that the same could be said about every ancient event. In fact, it could be said about every historical event, because you could always come up with some sort of an alternate explanation. So when we make decisions in life, we don't make decisions based on absolute certainty. We make it based on probability. So you may go to the grocery store in a day or two to get some food that you need, to restock up on some food. You do so and you think that you're going to come out safe and not get the virus, the coronavirus, as a result. you do that because you think it's most probable that's going to happen. Or even when this is all over, you drive or you fly somewhere, you do so because based on the data that you have reasonable confidence, reasonable certainty that you're going to get there safely. And so you go. If we're waiting for 100% certainty before we go somewhere, we're going to spend the rest of our lives at home. So we're looking for reasonable certainty, not 100%.
I also wanted to mention that we're really just going to scratch the surface here, because Gary gave an overview of the 6 different facts that, as a result of his investigation, and you can give arguments and evidence for each one of these facts. And I don't know that we'll get a whole lot into it today in this episode. We're going to focus on questions and maybe some alternate explanations, why those fail, that kind of thing. But that is not to say that that's where the end of it is. So the whole point of me bringing up the books earlier in the show is that if you want more, if you want to go deeper, you want to hear some of the arguments, some of the evidence, why these skeptical scholars accept these facts, then head over and pick up the books, read the books. Don't just stop at a YouTube video where we're giving like a summary of the arguments and interacting with some questions. If you want to go deep and if you want to be serious about it, you've got to do the hard reading. You've got to do the hard work of taking it seriously, doing your research. And so that's what I encourage you to do if you want to go deeper. But Mike, you said, Gary gave 6 facts. Do you agree? Would you give 6 as well, or would you limit it to 3, or would you add some? What's your case look like?
Depends what I feel like at a particular day. To be honest with you, I talk about resurrection so much. I'm sure Gary's the same way, that, we might just get tired of a certain way and we want to just change things up. So the 3 that I gave in my doctoral dissertation, if I recall here, was, and in the big book, is Jesus died by crucifixion. Number 2, shortly after his death, a number of his followers had experiences, like Gary said, they were convinced were appearances of the risen Jesus. And number 3, a skeptic, a persecutor of the church named Paul, also had an experience he was convinced was an appearance of the risen Jesus, and he became a follower of Jesus as a result, had a transformed life. Now, those are virtually 100%. I mean, of course, you may have a few out there who deny that Jesus ever existed, but Richard Carrier, he's leading the charge and saying Jesus was a myth, and he's a bona fide historian, a professional historian. By the last count of which I was aware, he only gave 7, including himself, 7 bona fide scholars in a relevant field in the world who think that Jesus never existed or probably didn't exist. There are more people, more credentialed bona fide scientists who believe our Earth, our universe, is 15,000 years old or less than there are bona fide scholars who think that Jesus never existed. So when we talk about a consensus, a universal consensus of scholars, of course, we're not talking about 100%. We're talking about 99.999%. And you may not get there with James, but you get there with Paul, you get there on Jesus' death, you get there on the disciples had experiences. And so those are the ones that I used in the book. Afterward, I started to use some others. I started to throw in that they believe bodily resurrection. So I went away from the kind of method that I used in my book, which I think, builds a very strong case for the resurrection. But I just wanted to, I'm convinced, based on the research I did that's in the book, that Paul and the earliest Christians were proclaiming that Jesus rose bodily, physically from the dead. And I wanted to throw those arguments out there and see how the skeptics would respond. And I enjoyed doing it because I think the responses that they have given are all easily addressed. And I think we can raise the confidence that Jesus was raised bodily, physically from the dead. So a lot of times I just bring that into the scene. One other thing I'll throw in there is that more recently, just to make things real simple, I go back to the original argument that I gave for the resurrection more than 20 years ago. And I used the same kind of method that C.S. Lewis used with the Great Trilemma, which later became Lord Liar Lunatic. And I just started off with one fact that Gary says virtually 100% of scholars acknowledge, and that is that Jesus disciples had experiences they proclaimed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Actually, I go even less than that. Jesus' disciples claimed he rose and appeared to them. And I established that. And then I say, all right, he either appeared to them or he did not. If he did not, they either thought he did or they did not think he did. So it was either lie or hallucination or identical twin or something, and you rule all those out. And then you come over here and you say, okay, he did appear to them. So either he didn't die and they thought he did, or he actually did die and rose from the dead. And you can eliminate all these things through a nice logic tree. And the only option you're left with is that Jesus rose from the dead.
Let's get into some of the evidence for the appearances. What is like the top, well, I want to say top three, but where would you start in defending that fact that the disciples experienced what they took to be the risen Jesus?
I'm going to say that the best single argument, and boy, you're going to have such unanimity here, even with scholars who don't believe the resurrection, is the creedal passage in 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following. I don't know. I don't work in other fields of New Testament. Maybe Mike has a response, but it may be the most commented on passage in the New Testament, at least in apologetic terms. And there, Paul starts by saying in verse 3, I delivered unto you that which I also received. Now, I mean, a scholar like Pincus Lapide, who's a non-Christian Jewish scholar with a PhD in New Testament from a major German university. He passed away. But I mean, when he wrote a book in the early 80s, The Resurrection of Jesus, a Jewish perspective, he gives, I believe, 10 linguistic arguments for this being an early creed. And most people would just yawn, most scholars would just yawn while you're doing it because this material is so well known. And I could give you a list of scholars, beginning with Reginald Fuller, way back in 1979, come up to the present. You've got Richard Bauckham. You've got James D.G. Dunn. You've got a guy named Ware up in Indiana. These guys would tell you that the consensus New Testament view now, consensus, is that this material is pre-Pauline. There's two kinds of pre-Pauline. Before Paul was converted, this thing was in existence. And sometime after Paul's conversion, before 1 Thessalonians, often dated the earliest book of the New Testament. The second sense of pre-Pauline is there before 1 Thessalonians was written. Okay, or the other epistles. But they generally say, even the Jesus Seminar, which reject up to 90% of the red letter words of Jesus, tell you that the majority of their voters said this is pre-conversion of Paul. So it dates from 2 to 3 years after the cross. And it's pre-conversion, post-crucifixion, obviously. You've got James Dunn saying maybe the same year. You've got other guys saying 30 AD. You got Bergerman giving a list from 1 to 2 years later. Extremely early. Yeah, they just yawn while you're doing it, seriously, because they're just going to grant it. And the minimal part of the creed, different views on how far the creed goes, but the minimal view is that verses 3 to 5, Paul states it, and then he gives the beginning. And in that beginning, the lowest common denominator is a group appearance to the 12. And the rest of the creed, there's 2 more appearances, to a group called all the apostles, which is bigger than the 12, and a group called 500 brethren. Now, what you take the word brethren to me, if brethren for Paul means you guys or you all, then maybe there's 500 there. If this means men alone, as it sometimes means in the New Testament, there could have been 1,000 or 1,100, 1,200 people there, like on a mountainside, which is suggested. So we have 3 group appearances, one very large by any count, and their group appearances confirmed pre-Pauline. Barterman says Paul probably got it in Jerusalem from James and Peter, and he probably got he could have, Ehrman says, could have gotten all of his creeds in Jerusalem from before he was converted. They would have existed. And that's how early it is. I would go with that passage right now. And if you said, well, pick one of the 3, I would say the best attested appearance we have is the appearance of the 12. The appearance of the 12. But, I will tell you, I've got a friend who surveys very, very skeptical scholars and copies their responses. And he asks one question. He asks. He's sent me over 1,000 emails from these guys, and he quotes them. At least it claims to quote them. Okay, and he asks them, "What do you guys think about the appearance of the 500?" And I am surprised. Many Jesus seminar guys go, "Yeah, I can't believe in hallucinations because the appearance of the 500 does it for me." And I'm going, "How gullible are you guys? Come on, be stricter than that. Be tough. Go with the 12. See what you can, So I would take absolutely 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7. Paul adds his appearance in verse 8. But 3 through 7, with 3 appearances to groups, unquestionably the strongest data on the appearance narratives in the New Testament.
Here's why this is so important. Is once you accept that there were these appearances, these people had these experiences, you've got to have some explanation as to why it happened. So that's why people turn to something like the hallucination hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that these groups or these individuals, whatever scenario you're talking about, whichever one you're referring to in 1 Corinthians 15, they had these hallucinations, just like there was these Elvis sightings after Elvis died. So these people had these hallucinations, and that's the explanation. But the point is, once you grant that these appearances happened as a matter of history, then you've got to explain them somehow. And so that takes us into, let's talk about the hallucination hypothesis. What is it? Why do you think that it fails to account for the data, or why is it a bad hypothesis?
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, well, a lot of work. First of all, let's talk about what a hallucination is. A hallucination is a false sensory perception. Something through your natural senses, it would appear you're picking up, but it's not actually there. So you might think you're seeing something, but it's not there. An auditory hallucination, you think you're hearing someone call you or some music, but that's not really there. Smell, taste, you might think that like when we got a cell phone and we put it on vibrate, silent and vibrate because we're going into a meeting, and in the middle of that meeting, we thought that it vibrated in our pocket, and we pulled it out, and it's like, nobody loves me. That is called a tactile hallucination. And then a kinesthetic hallucination is you have the sense of motion. So when you are dreaming, you're falling and you wake up, that is a kinesthetic hallucination. So most people have hallucinations at some point in their lives. We can say that the hallucinations typically occur in a single mode. So you may feel the vibration in your pocket from the phone, but you don't hear it. The people who do experience hallucinations in multiple modes are people who are high on drugs or who are schizophrenics. But other than that, typically people experience hallucinations in a single mode. The kind of person that is most likely to experience a hallucination are people who are grieving over the loss of a loved one. And in multiple studies, it comes out to about 50% of them experience a hallucination of some sort, but only 7% experience a visual hallucination of that person. Moreover, hallucinations are, because they are private occurrences in the mind of an individual and they have no external reality to them, you can't share your hallucination with someone else. So when you have the perception that your cell phone vibrated in your pocket because you got a text message, the person next to you didn't say, "Hey, who was that who just sent you a text?" It's not like you both experienced that. Hallucinations are like dreams. So I can't wake my wife up and say, "Hey, Deb, I just had a dream. I'm in Maui. So go back to sleep. Join me in my dream and let's have a free vacation." You can't do that. No, we might go back and dream that we're both in Maui, but we're not having the same dream and we can't interact with one another in that dream. So with these things in mind, consider that number one, all our earliest reports and what we also find in the Gospels is that Jesus appeared to 100% of his disciples, 100%. And he appeared to them. That would be visual. So it's not 7%, but an unthinkable 100%. who experienced a hallucination would have had to experience a visual hallucination of Jesus. Second, you've got, as Gary mentioned, if there's one piece of data within that early oral tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, it's the appearance to the 12. So you've got a group appearance there. In fact, as Gary mentioned, you've got 3 group appearances in that earliest tradition. You've also got group appearances in the canonical Gospels, in Matthew, Luke, John, and it's implied in Mark 14:28. So you've got group appearances, multiple independent sources attest to the group appearances. If they're group appearances, they're not hallucinations, right? And then finally, you look at Paul. Paul was not grieving over Jesus' death. He thought Jesus was a failed Messiah, a false prophet. So Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see. So those are 3 reasons right there why we can reject the hallucination hypothesis. Well, we could throw a 4th one, and it's just not based on a minimal fact, you could say. And that is, if Jesus' tomb was empty, hallucinations do not explain how the tomb got empty. So there's a lot more that we could talk about with this, but the hallucination hypothesis, even though it's the most popular amongst skeptical scholars today, it is perhaps the weakest hypothesis. If not the weakest, it's certainly one of the weakest, historically speaking.
Well, if you guys are enjoying this video today, I want you guys to subscribe to my channel, hit the little subscribe button, but then also hit the little bell and turn on all videos so you can get notifications when we post new videos. It's actually more important to do that these days than hit the subscribe button. So really appreciate you doing that. We are about to move to Q&A. And what I want to focus on, like if you're a skeptic or if you're an atheist and you have doubts about the resurrection, I want to hear your question. Those are the questions that I want to put up today and have Mike and Gary respond to those. So if you are a skeptic, you're an atheist, or if you're someone who's a Christian and you're just doubting and you have a very serious doubt, a very serious question, post that in the comments. We are going to have to get through some super chats first, so appreciate you guys who are sending in super chats, and we may only get to those today, but these are the types of questions that we're taking today, or questions from skeptics. So Gary, to pass it over back to you while we get some questions in the live chat. What about this idea that, as a general principle, we should prefer non-miraculous explanations over miraculous explanations?
Well, there's going to be some disagreement on this one, even over Christian apologists. I am one of the guys who take what I would call the harder line. I would say, yes, within reason, incredible claims include... Now, I'm going to be careful using the word incredible. First of all, the word doesn't usually have the... I don't know if you notice this, but the word incredible, the definition is changing and has a different definition than we usually use it for. But a lot of people think that if you make an astounding claim, you need astounding evidence. And I'm okay with a miraculous claim requires better evidence. What kills me about skeptics is that their meaning, oftentimes, incredible claims require incredible evidence. The thing with them is you never get the evidence. It doesn't make any difference. Like those 6 facts I gave you, Cameron, if you count every creed and every criterion that New Testament scholars use to determine facts, critical scholars, there are over 100 pieces of data that back up those 6 facts. 100. Is 100 outstanding? Yeah. Is it enough? Yeah. Is it enough that virtually every critic there is will grant these 6? Yes. Is it consensus view? Yes. So you believe Jesus was raised yet? No. We need incredible evidence. Well, I just gave you 100. Well, how many do you think are good? I mean, even the Jesus Seminar allows 10% of the red letter words of Jesus. How many are you going to allow of the backup for the 6? So I just object to the reason. Yes, I think we need better evidence than normal. But I don't think incredible means so much that nobody ever gets there, and they think, often non-scholars, they call themselves scholars, but they're often not. Often the answer is, yeah, that's not enough. That's not enough. What's your comeback? Oh, that's not enough. I don't need to give you a comeback. That's not enough. That's not enough. And that's your answer for everything. There's a point at which you have to deal with the data you have.
Hey, can I throw something in?
Go for it.
Yeah. I've given this a lot of thought. I still have to give it some more, but I don't know that we need better evidence. Think about this for a moment.
I told you there were differences between apologists. Go ahead, Mike.
Think about this for a moment. And I'm thinking about this as a philosopher of history. Let's take a hypothetical situation. I've given this one before, but let's just say that I'm lecturing on some university campus or at a conference, and some terrorists come in and they come up on stage and they say, Licona, you've debated Muslims. You've said that Islam is a false religion. You've got to die. And they kill me right there on stage. They behead me. And then they leave quickly, leaving my headless corpse on the stage. Everybody rushes out of the auditorium. They call the police. An hour later, people are out there being interviewed by police and the media. And then I come out walking out of the auditorium. My head's attached. I'm in perfect health. You can see some scars where I was beheaded. And I said, hey, I was just, God just brought me back to verify once again that Jesus is the Son. He provides the way to salvation. And then I turned to someone in the crowd and I said, hey, while I was in heaven, I actually spoke to one of your dead friends who died 5 years ago. And he told me that he had a private conversation with you 1 hour before he died, and nobody else knew about it. And here are the details of it. And I give you the details, and they're exact. Now, everybody who saw that happen, there's nothing extraordinary about being an eyewitness to something like that. I mean, it's just you were there. It's no different than you being an eyewitness at a football game or a baseball game or a sporting event or a concert or something. You're still an eyewitness to an event. It's just the event itself was extraordinary, right? But being an eyewitness there is no more extraordinary than it is if you were sitting in at a baseball game. So, but it would be sufficient to establish that the event occurred. So what's the deal? Why do you require extraordinary evidence?
I'll say one thing about that, and then we'll move to Q&A, because we don't want Gary to come back on that. We don't want to turn this into a debate. I'm just kidding. But so I had
which Mike and I do all the time. But go right ahead.
He usually wins too.
So I did an interview with Dr. Tim McGrew, and we're getting in so many super chats, so I really appreciate it, guys, and we're going to get to them in just a second. I did an interview with Dr. Tim McGrew, and we talked about this extraordinary evidence, or extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and we had a great discussion on this. So go check it out in the archive of our videos. I don't have it linked in the description of the video, but you can find it on our channel pretty easily. And one of the things that he pointed out was anything that you can do, anything you do with a big piece of evidence, you can do with a bunch of small pieces of evidence. But a lot of people don't really feel the force of a lot of small pieces of evidence, because it's just, I don't know, when you think about it, you want one big piece. You want like video evidence. You want DNA evidence. You want a big piece that's going to like push you over the edge. But anything you can do, and this was Tim's point, anything you can do with a big piece of evidence, you can do with a lot of little pieces of evidence. And for the resurrection, I think that we have a bunch of little pieces of evidence that sort of all weigh up, and yeah, that's how the resurrection case kind of works. So you don't necessarily need a big, extraordinary piece of evidence, because in the end, in probability theory, you can do it with a bunch of small pieces. All right, and Gary,
I would add though, Cameron, we do have some big pieces. We do have I would say I would change that just to this extent. We've got a few big ones and a lot of little ones, and the combination is awesome. But for whatever that's worth.
Yeah. No, I think that's right too. All right, so let's get to some questions. So let me pull up my question scene with all three of us here. So this one is not necessarily a question, but it is super chat, and I want to highlight his channel, JMD Apologetics. I'm waiting for it to pop up on my screen here. Let me see if my software is going to do this. There it is. Super chat, $2. Thank you so much. He says, Habermas and Licona, what do these guys know? He's a Christian apologist. So go follow him. Go subscribe to his channel. I appreciate your super chat, brother. And let's get to the next one here. I'm scrolling down my feed. Here's one. Would it be possible to get Habermas, Licona, and NT Wright together in a live chat? We could possibly throw that together. Are you guys familiar with Tom Wright?
I've heard of him.
I've done live chats with Tom. It's In fact, by the way, we had a live chat years ago. Tom Wright, myself, and Tony Flew, the famous atheist. We did a live chat. So
Wow, that's
Tony's
cool.
passed away now, but I mean, sure, it's all possible.
All right, here's the next question. Another super chat from Ronald. Thank you so much. He says, what evidence outside of the Bible is there that the story of the resurrection is not just another religious story from a religious book? Thank you for the conversation.
I'll take a stab. First of all, I want to say something about that kind of. I'm not saying Ronald's saying this at all, but it kills me when people say, yeah, you just used a circular argument. Use the New Testament to back up the New Testament. Well, I'll tell you what. Why, when you pick up Bart Ehrman's Did Jesus Exist, an atheist New Testament scholar, why does he use the New Testament to prove the non-New Testament? He uses, here's why. Let me use a silly little illustration. Mike does way better with illustrations like the Titanic and things like that. He does some excellent ones. But here's one for me. Spiders don't get caught in their own webs because different spiders do different things. But spiders know what strands to run on and what strands not to run on. Okay. Bart Ehrman quotes more verses from the New Testament than most Christians do that are trying to make a case. Why does he quote those? He answers the question and he says, I don't cite the New Testament because I think the New Testament is true. It's not reliable. But I know where to go for data. And he gives, in that context, he gives 15 independent sources for the resurrection of Jesus. I'm sorry. 15 independent evidences for the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, in that list of 15, 4 of them, to get to your question, 4 of them are not New Testament. 4 of them are outside the New Testament, but they make his period of time, Bart Ehrman's, 100-year period he asks for. So he goes from 30 AD to 130, and he has 4 sources that are not Christian. So yes, you can get sources outside. And if you want some examples, you've got a famous statement in Josephus that where he seems to be saying the disciples believed they saw Jesus risen from the dead, not that Josephus believed in the resurrection. We have some other arguments like that. Ben Witherington makes a really interesting argument. Now this takes another little cog, but he believes that the James Ossuary is authentic, and he and the Jewish editor of Biblical Archaeological Review wrote a book together and said it's authentic. And Ben Witherington makes an argument like this. He says the ossuary says, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. And he said, think about this. If James dies as a martyr, which we have first century evidence for, if he dies in 62 AD, he's in a bone box. He's reburied a year later, so now it's 63. And his family still wants to say that for James, he's pleased to be identified with Jesus, his son, brother, who he didn't believe in. Then James must have believed in the resurrection, most likely, or he never would have said. Now, that depends on whether you believe the James Ossuary. Here's another one for you. The carbon-14 dating on the shroud was exploded last year in October so badly that the guy that presented the argument with a team of 4 scholars published the critique in an Oxford University journal. And here's an odd thing. If I got this right, the editor of the Oxford Journal was one of the guys whose name was on the 88 carbon-14 argument against the shroud. And he's the editor now, and he published this article in the journal, and pretty much it's agreed the carbon-14 date on the shroud is wrong, and all the other data is positive. Now, I'm not saying the shroud is Jesus's. I'm pretty skeptical. Mike said earlier, it kind of depends on what side of the bed you got up in the morning. I'd like that with the shroud. Some days it looks better, some days it looks worse. But I'm just saying these are potential arguments. Maybe a bone box for James. Maybe a shroud for Jesus. Maybe Josephus's claim. But the main point I want to get to is Bart Ehrman's point, is you don't need to go outside the New Testament. Only use the verses don't need to go outside the New Testament. Only use the verses that are evidenced, and there's plenty of them. And the New Testament is our best argument. Better than the shroud, better than the James Ossuary, better than Josephus. So we've got it. So can you go outside the New Testament? Yeah, a fun question, but it's not only not needed, the best argument is the good New Testament strands, like the spider that picks the right ones.
Anything to add, Mike?
Well, it seems like the kind of objection that someone would say, and I'm not saying your person's a non-believer, but if they're saying, well, what do we got outside the New Testament? The question kind of emerges from, well, the New Testament, we want something better because the New Testament is written by Christian sources, and so therefore they're biased. And I would respond to that by just saying bias doesn't mean you're wrong. If you're going to discredit or look down on sources because they have a bias, then that would mean that we wouldn't want to read a history of slavery in the U.S. if it were written by an African-American historian. We wouldn't want to read a book on the Holocaust if it were written by a Jewish historian, because you'd say, well, these folks are biased, right? Well, of course they're biased, but that doesn't mean they're wrong. In fact, their biases could drive them to be a little more accurate than a Caucasian, a Gentile Caucasian. So just because it's biased doesn't mean you're wrong. Richard Dawkins said in his book, The God Delusion, he says in the beginning that if this book works as I intend, religious readers who pick it up will be atheists when they put it down. Well, is that bias? Of course it is. I'm writing these things so that you will not believe that Jesus is the Son of God or that God exists. So you wouldn't throw that book away or discount it because he's got a bias and an agenda. You would do it because his arguments suck. That's why. And the same thing with the New Testament. Of course the authors are biased, but if Jesus was who he claimed, they'd be in the best kind of position to know about him. And so we want to, bias is just a bad objection.
If I could add one thing, Cameron,
Go for it.
not to miss the forest for the trees. When I go to universities, I often start my lecture like this, and a lot of times I am co-sponsored by an atheist group on campus. And I'll start there and I'll say, this is the intro to the minimal facts argument. This precedes what we did earlier. And I'll hold up a little New Testament and I'll say, okay, if this book is inspired, did Jesus rise from the dead? And they'll say, well, yeah, if it's inspired, it's not. But if it was inspired, yeah. I'll go, okay, another New Testament. This New Testament is not inspired, but it's highly reliable. Good historical sources. Did Jesus rise from the dead? And these students often say very, very accurately, well, it depends on what passages are reliable and what aren't. I'll go, that's good. All right, now let's go to the worst New Testament there is. Let's go to a New Testament source where it's almost totally unreliable. Bart Ehrman's New Testament. The Jesus Seminar, where they reject 90% of the red letter edition of the sayings of Jesus. Let's say it's highly unreliable with Jesus raised from the dead. And everybody in the crowd goes, heck no. If it's highly unreliable, yeah, it's not real. And I'll go, all right, here's my argument tonight. It's called the minimal facts. And I'm going to say, on the worst of your Bibles, on this Jesus Seminar, Bart Ehrman, Rudolf Bultmann, New Testament, Jesus is raised from the dead. Now, I'm going to give you my argument, and if you think I'm wrong, come down and talk to me, and I'll stay here till the janitors kick us out of this room, and your job is to disprove my argument. Okay? So let's just remember, to answer that question, the whole point of the minimal facts argument is, let's use the lowest common denominator New Testament. Is bad, the prejudice is wrong, the everything's wrong, but we've got some good data. And if you get a resurrection from it on the worst New Testament there is, that's a remarkable case. So I think the best comeback is check our argument out. Check out the minimal facts argument. It uses the lowest common denominator argument, which is a nice synonym for the minimal facts argument. Use the lowest common denominator. If you still get a resurrection, beat that.
All right, let's see if we can speed through some of these. Spartan Theology says, what is the best response to people who deny the supernatural?
Well, I'd say practice voodoo. You'll find out or Satan worship, you'll find out pretty quickly that the supernatural exists.
Yeah, you know what? I would say there's a lot of ways to skin a cat on this one, and I'll just mention two or three, but only hit one. All the good arguments for God's existence, you may not like them, but if you think there's a good argument, that alone changes the argument. If this is a universe, Mike's the one who often says, yeah, the resurrection is impossible as a natural event. But if there's a God, he can do it. Here's all you need. Is there a God? Well, I sort of think that. And could he do a miracle if he wanted to? Well, I guess he could. Bingo. That's all you need to upset the rural view apple cart. Mike gave another one. What about the occult? But here's another one. Near-death experiences. Near-death experiences today, I just had a debate with a person a few years ago. I've had a number of them, but just a few years ago, published in a Oxford, published in Blackwell. It's out of Oxford. And in there, I recount 300 highly evidenced near-death experiences. I divide them into 5 categories of evidence. Okay, just to tell you there's hard evidence for NDEs. Here's the only point I'm going to make. If there is an afterlife, if there is an afterlife, that is very, very important because it says something in the realm of resurrection happens. Other people besides Jesus have had near-death experiences with sometimes data going hours after the machines saying they have no brain activity, no heart activity. So if we start with God, that's a whale of a head start for resurrection. If we start with NDEs and we know there's life after death, don't tell me Jesus couldn't have been raised from the dead. It's one of the species that it could be. So if there's a God, if there's an afterlife, Richard Swinburne has done an argument along these lines, and he uses 50-50 for God's existence, 50-50. And his conclusion in a highly reputable Oxford University book, Richard Swinburne concludes that the likelihood that Jesus was raised from the dead is 97% on a 50-50 God start. And then later, a name you've already brought up, the McGrews, Tim McGrew in particular, did an argument, and he told me just recently, he said, yeah, I like Swinburne's argument. I like Swinburne's argument, 97% reliable, using God 50-50. He said, I got one major problem with Swinburne. So what's your problem? He goes, his probability's too low. His probability's too low at 97%. I said, what do you think it should be, Tim? He said, 99.9. And if you know Tim, he's talking heavy evidence. He's doing evidence with Bayes' theorem and so on. He's not messing around. So yes, if you change any of these other things, you're going to get a basis to go after resurrection, and it's going to look really, really good.
All right, yeah, and I'm going to go to the next one because we've kind of already talked about that one, supernatural. All right, so this one is from Pelagia. I never know how to pronounce his name. He did a super chat, so thank you, Paul. He says, consider a notion that Peter and Paul were the only actual eyewitnesses to the really risen Jesus. Our Gospels and creeds would then be legendary stories. Do other lines of evidence exist that contradict such a scenario?
Yeah. The reports that we have in the Gospels and in Paul's letters, in Paul's letters, you've got the appearance to Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500 at one time, then to James, then to all the apostles, and then to Paul. So you've got some in addition to Paul. You've got 3 group appearances, right? And the group appearances are better attested, at least as well attested as the appearance to Paul and the appearance to Peter. You've got the Gospels that have Jesus appearing to his, in Mark. Mark knows that he's going to appear to them in Galilee as a group. You've got in Matthew, Jesus appears to the women folk on the way back from the tomb. He appears to all the male disciples out in Galilee. In Luke, you've got appearances to the 11, and then you have the to Peter, to the Emmaus disciples, and then all of them on the ascension. In John, you've got the appearance to Mary Magdalene, probably the rest of the women involved. We could discuss that if you want. Then you've got the appearance to all but Judas. And then you've got the appearance to all, including Judas. Then you've got the appearance to 7 disciples on the Sea of Galilee. So, and So yeah, you've got multiple appearances, and you've got multiple independent accounts, at least from Matthew, Luke, and John, because you've got a recurrent attestation, and then Paul. So, what more you're looking for here? Multiple independent sources, and sources that are rooted in eyewitness testimony, if not eyewitness themselves, like you have with Paul, and probably with John, and Mark is based on the eyewitness testimony, rooted in the eyewitness testimony of Peter. That's what a majority of New Testament scholars today, since 1965, have believed. So there's really good evidence.
I'll add one more, Cameron. This is Bart Ehrman again. This is what the minimal facts argument is. We let the critics do the argument for us. Bart Ehrman says there's the two best arguments for the historicity of Jesus. One is the crucifixion, or 15 independent sources. But his other one is that Paul went to Jerusalem at +5 years after Jerusalem. He interviews Peter and James. And then before the book of 1 Thessalonians is written, so still pre-canonical, he goes to Jerusalem again, and this time Peter, James, and John are there. Then you got Paul, of course, he's there. That's the 4 biggest, most influential names in the early church, and 2 of the names are not on the list here. It says, what about Peter and Paul? Okay, what about James and John? James, the brother of Jesus, and John. They're all there together, and it specifies that Paul went to talk about the gospel. Paul defines the gospel several times. It always involves the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. I can't even imagine a meeting where Paul didn't say something like, hey, I'll tell you guys what Jesus looked like to me on the road to Damascus if you tell me what Jesus looked like to you on Sunday evening. What do you think? And anyway, they discuss the gospel. The resurrection is an indispensable portion, as Paul says. And Bart Ehrman says, a remarkable sentence, where do we get closer to eyewitness testimony than Paul's recounting what he got for James and Peter? That's Galatians, a trusted epistle of Paul. Everybody allows it. So he goes there and gets it. So Paul did, to me, the biggest thing Paul brings to the table is not even his appearance. The biggest thing Paul did was interview the other disciples that saw the disciples in a group. To me, that's a knockout, and it's conceded by virtually everybody at +5 years after the cross, and the creed is existing before that. This data it's fantastic.
All right, let's move on. So next one, this is not a question, but it's a really cool thing. Nicholas Brainerd says, Habermas brought me to Jesus Christ. Thank you, sir. I think that's amazing. Okay, so I actually partnered with Mike Winger on this. I don't know if you guys know who he is. He has a YouTube channel. It's called Mike Winger. And so what he's doing, in about 2 hours after we finish our live stream, he's doing a stream on how to be saved. So if you're watching this live stream and you're thinking, yeah, there's a lot of evidence for Christianity, for the truth of Christianity, and I want to give my life to Christ, then I'm going to point you to that video to go get saved, basically today, right now. So I think that's really cool that we were able to partner with Mike on that. All right, let's move on. Anything to say about that, Gary? This comment from
I think it's the most awesome testimony in the world, and there's a reason for that. The three of us can stand here, actually sit here. We can sit here, and we can say, boom, 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 more evidence, more evidence, more evidence. But the question I get most of all is, probably the one I get the most is, hey, if the evidence is as good as you think it is, how come all the skeptics don't become Christians? And the easiest answer is, look, I could talk to my best buddy, try to convince him I think marriage is better than not, being single. So I want to introduce this person to a blind date, tell him that this lady is the best in the world. He dates her. He comes back. He says, she's everything you said. Man, she is a winner. And I go, hey, can I be your best man? And he said, hey, you're missing a very important part of this argument. She's everything you say. I went on the date. Everything was great, except I don't want to make a commitment. And saying I do to Jesus, I prefer that language because that's what the word means in the New Testament. Saying I do to Jesus means to make a commitment. to that person. And a lot of people are into data, but they're not into commitments. And so they're just not willing to come. So anyway, what I get from all this is the combined strength of the three of us here cannot get a person into the kingdom of God, according to the New Testament. It's a work of God. And if God puts it in you, God will finish it. That's what Paul says in Philippians chapter 1. So you can lead a horse to water, you can't make a horse drink. If somebody has been drinking from this well with data, I say, wow, that's an act of God. God's done something. And I think it's the greatest comment in the world.
If you guys want to watch that video, it's just linked in the description. Like I said, if you're watching this live, give it about 2 hours and he'll go live on his channel. But if you're watching this in the future, you can just click the link and watch the video immediately. All right, next question is from Godless Engineer. He's another atheist YouTuber. He says, why are only Christian supernatural miracles considered to be real miracles while others are dismissed as not real miracles? I think he's thinking of non-Christian miracle accounts.
Go for it, Mike.
Yeah, I don't a priori dismiss them.
I don't either. That's two of us. In fact, I'll tell you there's some examples. But I think C.S. Lewis makes a really good point here. He said, when I first became a Christian, I assumed I had to explain away all the miracles in other religions. He said, I don't do that anymore. And he gives like 5 reasons why God can allow miracles in other religions. I buy it. I think it's true. There's no need to, go after it. But I will tell you this. If you study the data, especially if you're talking about the first century, nobody's on the planet with the sources Christians have. Let me just try a few real quickly. Zoroaster, the biggest theological book for Zoroastrianism, 1,000 years after he died. The Bhagavad Gita for Krishna, the earliest copy we have, 4,200 years after it was written. The story of Buddha, Confucius, and Lao Tzu from the Far East, in their earliest writings, they were naturalists. They didn't believe in God's existence. Now, they believed some weird things by today's standards, but they were naturalists. Moses, Muhammad, they claimed to be prophets, not the Son of God. That's the one unpardonable sin in Islam. So before we assume that we should just allow these things, I'm going to ask for the same data. I'm going to ask for the same data, and I want somebody to step up to the plate and tell me they have the same comparable data that we have for miracles. I'll end on this comment. Ed Yamauchi, retired professor of history, University of Miami of Ohio, said that Jesus is the only founder of a world religion who is believed by his followers within a generation to be a miracle worker. Only one in history. So, yeah, I'm open to other miracles, but I think you need data. You just don't stick it out there and say, you have to give big evidence. I just have political correctness. That's not gonna do it.
Yeah, and when you look at the miracles that's talked about it, in ancient religions, ancient accounts like Apollonius of Tyana, Honi the Circle Drawer, Hanina Mendoza, they're nothing compared to what we have for Christianity.
Yeah.
All right, next question from...
Just take the two, there's one sentence, just take the 2 rabbis there. The earliest source is like 200 years later. So why do you put 200 years on a table with a trip from Paul to interview the disciples at +5 and the early creed at +1 or 2? I mean, there's just no comparison.
All right, so from Mark Tenenbaum, he says, how can you justify saying the resurrection hypothesis is more probable than others if it relies on a miracle? Don't you need to prove miracles first?
Yeah, I don't think so. Let me give it a counterexample. Let's just say that astronomers have been watching a comet for the last decade, and now they estimate that it's going to crash into the lunar surface on a certain day and time. And when that day arrives, the Hubble Space Telescope and other planetariums around the world are all zeroed in on it. And at the appointed time, the comet slams into the moon's surface. And as the lunar dust settles, there's a message written on the moon's surface, and it says, Jesus is Lord, and it's written in Hebrew and in Greek. Now, that would seem to be a miracle. I don't have to prove God's existence beforehand. I don't have to prove that miracles can exist because the event itself does both, right? It's the one that I gave a little earlier about being beheaded, then coming back to life. You don't have to believe in miracles before then, but you will afterward.
Anything to add, Gary?
Yeah, I would take what Mike is saying and apply it to the resurrection. With the resurrection, you've got the only founder of a major world religion who claimed to be divine. I know that sounds strange, but try to find another one that you have recorded in the early sources. If Jesus said he was the Son of God, and he said a couple times in the Q document of all places, he says a couple times that he's going to give the sign to the prophet Jonah is going to be the only sign he's going to give skeptics. Later, he shows himself to others. He tells John the Baptist to go look at the miracles he does when John wonders if he's the Messiah or not. Jesus gives this test. If Jesus claims to be the Son of God, he says he's going to arise from the dead. Mike has done a lot of great work on the predictions. In fact, I don't know if Mike would still say this, but there was a day not long ago when Mike thinks predictions of the resurrection need to move into the circle of minimal facts. But Jesus predicts it ahead of time. If he makes all these incredible claims, predicts the resurrection ahead of time, which means you're a real doofus if it doesn't happen, then it happens. I also believe that would be an example of the kind Mike's talking about. You have God rolled into resurrection if it happened. And not just because Jesus claimed to be God, but, if he's dead, one thing we know from the laws of nature, this question assumes the laws of nature. One thing we know, dead men don't do much. And if Jesus was raised, somebody else had to act on him. He said years before, it's his Father. If I have a resurrection, and he told me that years before, I think that's a better solution than some of the half-baked ones that don't even work out with the data.
All right, so here we have one from Bert Sperling. He says, I'm an atheist with a degree in philosophy from Dartmouth. Do these guys have any data that doesn't come from the Bible?
We've already answered that. You want to do it again?
Yeah, I mean, we've got data. You've got things like Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Marabar Serapion, that mention, these are non-Christian sources, unsympathetic sources. Some of them, like Lucian and Tacitus, are hostile sources. You've got some other Christian sources outside of the Bible, like Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Papias, things like that, from which we can mine data. But we did answer that earlier, and that is, but maybe Bert wasn't, maybe he's just joining recently. And that is even atheist New Testament scholars like Bart Ehrman, like Gerrit Ludemann and others, and many non-believing New Testament scholars and historians will grant certain things in the New Testament. Look, I'm a Christian, I'm not a Muslim, but there are certain things I can read in the Quran. I don't believe it's divinely inspired. I believe it's entirely man-made, but there are things that I can understand about Islam from that time and what Muhammad believed by reading the Quran, right? So when the Quran says that God only made it appear that Jesus died, but he didn't, and he took him to heaven in Surah 4, then I can know that Muhammad and other Muslims in that period were saying that Jesus did not die, okay? And therefore he did not rise from the dead. When the Quran has Allah asking Jesus, did you say that you, Mary, and I are all gods? And Jesus says, far be it from me to have said that. You are the only God, and I'm your servant. Well, I don't believe Jesus actually had that conversation with God, but it does tell me that Muslims in the 7th century were saying that Jesus is not divine. He's not God. So atheist and agnostic and Jewish scholars can come to the New Testament, come to the Gospels, the letters of Paul, and look at them the same way and arrive at the conclusions at certain facts, these kind of minimal facts that Gary has been presenting.
Yeah, and Bert, my field is also philosophy. I have a PhD from a secular school. I'm chair of the philosophy department at Liberty University. And by the way, philosophers don't have an edge on the market. Maybe Mike implied this earlier. Maybe highly intelligent people can be the most slanted. We all have to look at our slanting, and that includes us. I will repeat one quick sentence that I gave earlier. In Bart Ehrman's atheist Bart Ehrman, and his 15 sources for the crucifixion of Jesus, 4 of them are from outside the New Testament, all early by his demarcation of early. So yes, there are many other sources. In one of my books, I gave 18 sources for the life of Jesus, all non-Christian, all outside the New Testament.
All right, let's get to another question from Dean Meadows. He says, Dr. Gary Habermas and Licona, how would you say, or how can we say that there is good evidence for the Joseph of Arimathea burial narrative when the place and person aren't mentioned extra biblically?
Guys, it's the same question over and over again. It's the assumption, I'm assuming, it's the assumption that the New Testament reference isn't enough. And you have many, as Mike said, you have Jewish New Testament scholars, you have agnostic New Testament scholars, atheist New Testament. You'd be surprised how many there are. And you'd be surprised how many admit this fact. In fact, I just saw a Jesus Seminar guy who's unpublished on this, but he just said recently that he has no problem with this because it fits the data. It fits what we know. It's plausible given our historical structure. So there are other ways to get the data than saying the New Testament's true because it's inspired. Our thesis is whatever the New Testament is, we'll only use the reliable passages to get there.
All right, we have a really cool comment from Cy Gart, who I interviewed. He is a scientist who recently came to faith a few years ago and wrote a book on it. It's really awesome. He says, "Great show and inspiring words. Thanks to all." Are you guys familiar with Cy?
I'm not.
Thank you.
He's relatively new on the scene, and he's awesome. He's really cool. All right, so we have
Way
another.
to go, Cy. Keep up the good work, brother.
Absolutely.
We have another super chat from Dean Meadows. He says, "Dr. Habermas, when will your magnum opus be released?"
Boy, I wished I knew. Okay, I hope to have the first draft, the major 5,000 pages, by the end of this year. If I'm really, really hopeful, October, November, maybe. It's going to take me a year to edit it because I have to work through everything, and this started 6 years ago, and I have a lot of sources I did 6 years ago that I'd like to reframe right now because I've got new data and usually from the critics, but I've got new data. So maybe a year to finish this year, a year to edit. And then I just told my research assistant, Ben Shaw, just yesterday, I think what I better do when I edit is I'll try to edit what's going to be volume 1 first and volume 2. Ben's already working on volume 2. We've already got the data. We've got the data done. It's 1,500 pages. And it is all the results of this survey I've done. And it's a head count of thousands of sources and where scholars are on this topic. It doesn't debate them. It just tells you where everybody is on 140 sub-issues. That's volume 2. So if I edit the first 2 volumes early, maybe I don't have to do all 5 before they start coming out. I guess that's where I'm going with that. So I don't know. 1 to finish, 1 to edit, and maybe 1 to get the first volume out, maybe 3 years.
All right, I just wanted to mention that if you guys are enjoying this content, enjoy my videos, and you want to support my ministry, Capturing Christianity, head over to patreon.com/Capturing Christianity. You can support me there on a monthly basis. Right now, we're actually in the middle of launching a Spanish YouTube channel. That's where all the funds are going right now, to hiring someone full-time to transcribe all of our videos and do voiceovers and everything. So if you want to support the channel, that's the way to do it, patreon.com/Capturing Christianity. The link to that is in the description of the video. Next question from Joshua White. He says, Dr. Licona, given God's omnis, isn't it trivial to claim that he can fit any conceivable set of facts when a natural cause may be sufficient?
When he can fit any conceivable set of facts. I'm not sure what he means by that. But I think when it says when a natural cause may be sufficient, well, if a natural cause is sufficient, we have to, that changes things. Then you have to look at and weigh hypotheses according to those criteria I mentioned a little earlier: explanatory scope, explanatory power, less ad hoc, and plausibility. You weigh the hypotheses. Now, if the hallucination hypothesis explained the agreed upon facts, the knowable facts, as well as the resurrection hypothesis, then you'd have to bring in some other facts that maybe are very strongly evidenced, but not granted by a consensus of scholars today. So you bring in like second order facts to that, and then you submit the hypotheses like hallucination and resurrection to see which one fulfills the criteria best. But when you do this, I mean, when I did this and looked at the 6 most common hypotheses that are offered by scholars today, I didn't even have to go to that second step because the resurrection hypothesis beat all of the natural explanations and did so very handily. So it showed that the natural causes are not sufficient. None of them are sufficient in explaining the data. The resurrection hypothesis is the only one that does so.
All right, so we have another question, and this one may be a little off topic, but I'm gonna just throw it in here and see what you guys have to say about it. He says, "How should we interpret the Bible? For example, what about the story of Jonah and the whale?"
Go for it, Mike.
Oh, well, I am not an Old Testament scholar. I know that some have said that they think that Jonah wasn't meant to be a historical account. I am not an Old Testament guy. I have enough trouble understanding the cultural milieu of the first century, and that's where I'm focused. So I have several friends who are Old Testament scholars, and they tell me the Old Testament is a completely different ball game, and they envy those of us who work in the New Testament because we have so much more data. So I'm going to just reserve and say it's not my field and not comment further on it.
I'll make a real quick comment, and it's it's like the earlier statement. What does the minimal facts argument mean? Now, I realize that the questioner may not have meant this by the question, but if the question is, what do we do with, let's just expand it. What do we do with passages that are really, really difficult? The so-called genocide passages in the Old Testament. C.S. Lewis said he questions the book of Jonah. He questions Old Testament miracles. C.S. Lewis makes these comments himself. This may not be the questioner, but just to make sure, I want to say, Mike and I have a way of answering questions sometimes. We're together, and we have a blast when people ask questions like this. And we go, and someone says, what about Jonah? And we go, okay, and? What do you mean, and? Well, I'm asking about Jonah. I heard you. And? Well, what do you mean, and? Well, no, what do you mean? Well, I just wonder what I should do with Jonah. Well, I'd say put it on the back burner until you can do some more studying, but don't ever be tempted to think that it trumps the New Testament passages for this reason. Let me say it again. The New Testament, this is not my view, but the New Testament could be Rudolf Bultmann's New Testament. It could be John Dominic Cross's New Testament. It could be Bart Ehrman's New Testament. That's the New Testament we're using to make the minimal facts argument. So if you convinced me, if you said, well, hey, I'm throwing Jonah out, I'm throwing the genocide passages out, I don't like the earlier question, I don't like Joseph, Arimathea, and the burial. Okay. Do you get a resurrection? Oh, yeah, you get a resurrection from that. Okay, thank you very much. Do the rest of your research on those other things and get back to me, will you? Because this is a discussion on the resurrection. I don't worry about those other passages. If I'm going to spend my whole life on resurrection, I want to know what happened. And if I'm using the most questionable source, I mean, the New Testament's not questionable, but the way it's employed by Bultmann and Ehrman makes it pretty rough. If I can use that and get resurrection, now, if you don't like it, you can go after me on that. And I'm not saying the questioner's doing that, but we don't need those other things. We have more than resurrection in the New Testament, but that is the gospel that puts you on the yellow brick road. You're aiming for the Emerald City. Deity, death, resurrection, keep on marching. You'll end up in the Emerald City. And I think that's the more important thing here, not, okay, you guys have done a really good job. What about some other troublesome portions? Well, we're doing resurrection. Okay, so that's what we're doing.
Yeah, you kind of read my mind. I was gonna mention that. All right, so this one is from Elaw Chess. He says, don't forget to mention that most of the standard external sources seem to be getting their information from the Gospels, like in a feedback loop.
Well, what's the evidence for that? I mean, really? I don't think Josephus is going to be consulting the Gospels for history. I don't think Tacitus is going to be consulting the Gospels for his history, right in the history annals of Rome. So they're either getting some of this stuff because it was common knowledge around Rome at that time, or they're consulting Roman records. But there's no reason to think that they are consulting the Gospels.
And by the way, if they were, why would Bart Ehrman, we keep going back to guys who are skeptics and atheists, why would Bart Ehrman list 4 of these guys in the sources for the crucifixion of Jesus? Why would he list 4 non-canonical sources if Bart thought they're just copycatting from Matthew and Luke and so on? That doesn't make the grade either.
All right, next question is from Keenan. He says, is Pauly, Clement good sources for the apostles' views?
I guess I should take that because I've done some work with that. Polycarp and Clement of Rome, yeah, I think they're good sources for the apostles' views. The church tradition, and we have a number of different sources that suggest that Clement of Rome was an associate of the apostle Peter, and Polycarp was an associate of the apostle John, the son of Zebedee. Probably not as strong as what we have for Mark being an associate of Peter, but still fairly strong. And they're writing fairly early, especially Clement of Rome, at the end of the 1st century, perhaps even before the fall of Jerusalem. So what's really cool, if Clement of Rome is getting a bunch of his information from Peter and Polycarp from John, the son of Zebedee, that's pretty good. Now, if you want to read more on this, then I'd say check out my book, the big book on the resurrection of Jesus, a new historiographical approach. I have a whole section on Clement of Rome, Polycarp, and some others.
All right. Well, Gary, was there something you wanted to add?
Well, I'm just going to say, Mike's been passing out some great compliments today, and I will just say his book is the best book in print on the historical data that we have. 750 pages, and he chiefly deals with the historical issues. It's an excellent book, his InterVarsity academic press book.
All right, so that concludes our Q&A section. I really appreciate you guys sending in your super chats, and a few people just sent in thanking us for doing this show. So really appreciate you guys hanging out with us today. Is there anything that you'd like to leave the audience with as we close this video out? We can start with you, Mike.
Okay. Well, I'll do a little plug for HBU. We've got a Master of Arts in Christian apologetics there. It can be completed entirely at a distance. It's a fantastic program. We've got some great professors down there. Some of them are even leaving Liberty and coming down there. We've got some great folks down there, and it's a great school. Just to plug our YouTube channel as well. It's Mike Licona, Licona, and if you want to go there, we got a number of videos. Subscribe and click that bell button for us as well, so that you get alerted when we have a new video come out.
So, Mike, you're putting out a new video every day. Is that what you're doing right now in the month of April? Did I see that correctly?
That's correct. Every weekday we have a little video usually between 1 and 3 minutes, that's coming out every day that deals with the resurrection or Jesus or his death, something related to Jesus in that way.
So, we've
got a really cool series starting next month as well.
If you guys liked what you heard from Mike, then definitely go check out his YouTube channel. And Gary, before we went live, you were saying that you're thinking about starting your own YouTube channel.
I am, because I've got 3 very experienced people all volunteering their time, and they're all just sitting there saying, "Well, come on, are we going to do it or not?" And we're going to put it up. So, yeah. And you know what? I can't let the HBU thing go without a comment. We did lose one of our best professors to HBU lately, just an incredible professor, an ethicist, and they did get him. But I will say this, we have a PhD in apologetics. They're working on the MA, and you can't get it all by distance. So there's a comeback. But you know what? More seriously, Cameron, Mike and I just play around. We're really good friends. We do this all the time. We've spent, what is it, Mike, 22 weeks? We've had a half a week to a week together for 22 straight years?
No, it's been 24, 25 years in a row.
Yeah, I'm worried about
you've come and spent either a weekend or within the last decade or even longer. I think it's been even longer. We've been spending a week together around Labor Day. It's just awesome.
Well, I'm worried about the virus now. We gotta work something out. But Cameron, I'd say something. We play around a lot. Mike and I tease, but I'd say something really, really seriously. Back to my illustration of you're my best friend, and I think you should be married. I think married people are happier. And so I introduce you to somebody, and you go, yeah, everything you said, but no, you can't be my best man. I don't want to make a commitment. And then I went on to say, we can put an argument together, but we can't change lives. And that's something God does. And if a person is moved in that direction, I'm thankful for people to say, oh, you were real helpful to me. Mike was real helpful. Cameron was real helpful. I'm sure those all bless our hearts. But I would encourage somebody to take the next step and to use the marriage illustration. If you think the evidence is good, bite the bullet. Sometimes that's what it is. And consider an I do statement. Consider a relationship. If Jesus is who he said he is, it could be the most important decision you ever made. I'm just thinking of so many people recently who've said this resurrection. They're not Christians, the ones I'm thinking of, who said recently that the resurrection argument is probably the most important question to settle on the face of the earth. And the last guy to say that is a very well-known non-Christian who said, I just think I've come across the most important question of the world. Not a Christian. He'd tell you he's not a Christian. And when people are saying that, I just think this is an incomparably important issue. And the question is, what are you going to do about it?
Amen. And if you're that person, if you feel the Holy Spirit drawing you in to a relationship with God, and you want to start a relationship with Jesus Christ, then what I want you to do, and I don't want to sound preachy, but that's part of the point of doing this, is to bring people to Christ, to a knowledge and a relationship with Jesus. So if you want to learn how to be saved, then visit Mike Winger's channel, visit the video that he's doing in conjunction with this video. Like I said, it's starting live in about 2 hours from now. We're about to end this live stream, so if you're curious, you don't know what the next steps are, you're ready to take the next steps and you don't really know what to do, then that's a great video for you to check out. If you're watching this later on, then you can literally just click the video and watch it right now. So that's what I really encourage you to do. And on that note, I wanted to mention that we had a couple atheists that commented and sent in some super chats throughout this, Apologia and Godless Engineer. And so I just wanted to mention that they are literally contributing to more people coming to a knowledge of Christ. So I think that that's really cool. And on that, I wanted to say, so if you've watched this entire video, I want you to do something for me. I want you to go into the comments of this video, and I want you to write something out. I want you to write, by the way, Jesus rose bodily from the dead. That's what I want you to write in the comments. If you watch the whole video, not if you're just like tuning in at the very end. If you watch the whole thing, go into the comments, by the way, Jesus rose bodily from the dead. Well, I really appreciate you guys coming on to the YouTube channel here. If we have enough interest, then maybe we can throw something else together like this together in the future, but I really appreciate it. And we'll see you guys later. So really appreciate it.
Thanks, Cameron. Appreciate the work that you're doing, brother.
Good job, Cameron. It was a wonderful interview.
Awesome.